I know Lewis far better than I know most people living or dead. He was a fellow at Oxford. I've become a fellow at Oxford. He moved to Cambridge. I did my second degree at Cambridge. And indeed, I lived at his house, the Kilns. I had his bedroom as my bedroom.
The reason we've got you on to talk about this is argued because you potentially discovered an Easter egg hidden in the Narnian stories that no one up to that point had discovered. Tell us about this structure. Welcome to today's edition of Re-Enchanting. I'm Justin Brierley.
I'm Belle Tindall.
And this is the show where we aim to re-enchant an arguably secular, material, disenchanted world with the Christian vision of reality. And we have all kinds of interesting guests who join us to do that.
Including Dr. Michael Ward. Thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We're so excited. So just to introduce you, so you are a literary critic, theologian and renowned C.S. Lewis expert, teaching at both University of Oxford and Houston Christian University, obviously in Texas. Michael is the author of two incredibly profound books. There's Planet Narnia, The Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis, and After Humanity, A Guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. And so we are going to be talking with Michael about the inner workings of the Narnian universe, the nature of Lewis's imagination, and one of his most difficult works, or I think so, The Abolition of Man.
Great to have you join us, Michael.
Thank you.
In a way, this is a counterpart to another episode, also filmed down here in the crypt of Lambeth Palace, where we spoke to someone I'm sure you're very familiar with, Holly Ordway, about Tolkien and Middle-earth and her amazing spiritual biography of him. But we're going to get to your immense knowledge of Lewis and all things Narnia and Abolition of Man shortly. But tell us, what are you currently reading? We normally record on the top of Lambeth Palace Library. We're not there today, but we still want to ask, what are you currently reading?
I am currently reading a novel by Francis Spufford.
Oh, we love Francis Spufford.
A former guest on this
show.
show.
Has he really? Yeah, Golden Hill.
Yes.
Which I think was his first novel. And it's brilliant. It's amazing.
Yeah, it is. It's a brilliant book.
He's a very interesting man. I have met him once. In fact, he was interviewed for my documentary, The Narnia Code. That's when I first met him. But I first encountered him when he wrote that book, The Child That Books Built, about his own childhood reading. And the centerpiece of that book is all about his childhood reading of Narnia.
Cool.
And he loved Narnia. And he said he only ever read other books because he couldn't always be rereading Narnia. And for him, Narnia was the sort of Platonic ideal of literature. So he's got a great enthusiasm for Lewis and is turned into a great novelist himself, but also an apologist, a Christian apologist.
Well,
his
we
book,
spoke at
Unapologetic.
Absolutely.
I would encourage anyone watching or listening to go back to one of the very early episodes of
It might even
Re-Enchanting.
be number one.
Number two, I think.
Number two.
Possibly.
Very
but yes, talking about his 2012 book, I think, Unapologetic, in some detail. Yes, wonderful. Well, lots of great literary influences, obviously, all relating to Lewis. Any other books you're currently reading, or?
Yes, I'm reading as much as I can by and about A.L. Rouse, who was a historian, a fellow of All Souls, Oxford, a contemporary of C.S. Lewis's. They interacted a bit, usually rather sort of antagonistically to each other. And I'm getting into Rouse because of an article I'm writing about Narnia.
As one of Lewis's premier, I would say, biographers and thinkers, Michael, do you feel like you know Lewis almost better than you know, I don't know, your own family? I mean, is it at that kind of level?
Well, in some ways, yes. It's weird. I mean, when I was in the depths of my PhD research and sort of living and breathing Lewis, I one day went out to a pub and I found myself sort of channeling Lewis. I was beginning to talk like him.
Sure.
It was really weird. I was like being possessed. Fortunately, that has passed. But yeah, I know Lewis far better than I know most people living or dead.
Yeah, almost. But you're immersing yourself in the way his mind works, the way he sees the world, and in his language, in the way he speaks and explains and describes things. So that makes total sense. Can you take us way back to the beginning? if actually, I'm assuming that there was pre-Lewis life for you, but where did you first encounter C.S. Lewis, and what so captivated you right there at the start line that, you're speaking his language?
Well, there's not much of my life that sort of predates my awareness of C.S. Lewis.
Okay.
I mean, 'cause I must have been, I don't know, 4 or 5 probably when my
Right.
parents were reading The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe to me, and indeed to my 2 older brothers. We would jump into our parents' bed on a Saturday or a Sunday morning, and my mum would read a chapter or 2 of the latest Narnia Chronicle to us. Then we'd get up and have breakfast and go about our day's duties or go off to church, whatever it might be. So I was introduced to Lewis before I could even read him for myself.
Okay.
But because my parents said, "Have you noticed that Aslan is a bit like Jesus?" I was intrigued because I wasn't used to books having more than one level of meaning. So I immediately clocked C.S. Lewis as especially interesting. And as soon as I was old enough, I read Narnia for myself. And then in my teens, got into his other fiction and his apologetics, then to his scholarly writings. And then I did my first degree in English at Oxford. Of course, it had to be Oxford because of Lewis and Tolkien.
Of course.
And I've never stopped.
Yeah. I mean, would you say your life itself slightly mirrors Lewis?
Well, in some ways, yeah. I mean, obviously he's sort of stratospherically brilliant and knows everything about everything. I know a lot about Narnia. So there's a significant difference on that score. But yeah, we have both, I mean, both he and I shouldn't say we, like we're chums or anything.
We, yeah.
But, he was a student at Oxford. I was a student at Oxford. He was a fellow at Oxford. I've become a fellow at Oxford. He moved to Cambridge, as I did. I did my second degree at Cambridge, and also was a chaplain of one of the Cambridge colleges for a bit. So I've seen his, and indeed I lived at his house, the Kilns, for 3 years. I had his bedroom as my bedroom.
Okay, this is getting weird at this point. It's like, okay.
Was that intentional, or was that just pure accident?
Well, it was obviously intentional that I lived in his house.
Yeah.
That would otherwise been a most extraordinary coincidence.
Yeah, fair enough.
But the fact that I ended up in his bedroom was just sort of more or less accidental, because there are lots of bedrooms in the house that I could have had.
That was just the icing on the cake.
It was the icing on the cake, yeah.
I mean,
Wow.
I've looked around the Kilns a couple of times. You can sort of book a tour in and so on. And in a sense, I think it's kind of come into a kind of position now where it can be used by visiting scholars and things to Oxford, people who have an interest in Lewis. So it's almost like there's the physical place where he, lived and worked has kind of itself continued in that kind of vein, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. You can be a sort of resident scholar at the
right.
Kilns for a week, a month, a term,
Okay.
if you make the application and get accepted. So yeah, it's a sort of study centre, but still a house. It's still a domestic residence.
I mean, arguably, I get the sense that Lewis is even more famous, arguably, in America than he is in the
much
UK.
more, yes.
Yeah,
Is he? I didn't know
and
this.
probably that was true during his lifetime as well.
Yeah.
So inevitably, there's almost a whole industry that's almost built, I get a sense, around Lewis and obviously the mystique of the Oxford, environment and everything else. I mean, how much is that? Do you welcome that, I suppose? Do you sometimes have to kind of clear away some of the fairy tale stuff as well when doing this stuff?
I do welcome it because, I'm interested in promoting interest and knowledge of Lewis all over the world. And indeed, I've spoken in about 10 or 12 countries around the world on Lewis, but America much more than any other place, partly because they're a huge country, but also because just proportionately they seem to be more enthusiastic about Lewis than anybody else.
And what has captured particularly the American sort of interest in Lewis, do you think?
Well, of course, part of it is, they're an English-speaking country. Some would dispute that, but they don't have to read Lewis in translation.
Okay.
Like, I've spoken on Lewis in Spain and Romania and Denmark. So that's one thing. There's a strong strain of Anglophilia in much American culture, and a great respect also for Oxford as a kind of cultural and academic totem of distinction and achievement. And Lewis being not only a distinguished academic, but also a very devout and obviously thoroughly converted Christian, ticks lots of boxes as far as Americans are concerned, because he's sort of he's got sort of secular prestige, but he never sort of compromised on his Christian witness.
That seems like a good place to start, because we're going to dig into some of his work. But I feel like before we dig into where Jesus appears in his work, we better just briefly, and I know that this probably is a huge story to tell, but could you tell us a little bit about his conversion and where Jesus sort of popped up in his life? And because I think he calls himself, doesn't he? Where have I written it down? The most dejected, reluctant convert in all of England. How did that become a title he put upon himself?
Well, he was born and raised in a Christian home.
Okay.
And he was baptized as an infant. His grandfather was an Anglican clergyman in Belfast. And he was taken to church and taught all the usual things, he said, and believed them for the first 12 years of his life, roughly speaking. But then he fell away from the faith. He gave up on it, he said, with a great relief. Religion had become a huge burden to him, he said. Okay. And then, so for about nearly 20 years, he was calling himself an unbeliever. And then in his late 20s, early 30s, he begins to come back to faith, first of all, to belief in God, to theism. And in fact, it's when he becomes a theist that he describes himself in those words as the most dejected and reluctant convert.
So he hadn't made the full leap in that sense.
No, and it's very interesting that a lot of people think that describes his conversion to Christianity.
Yeah,
but
that's what I assumed. Okay.
He's the most reluctant and dejected convert to theism. And then a year or so later, he becomes a Christian. Or you might say, because I mean, this is an interesting theological question, whether he was actually converting or reverting, or just his own brother said he was sort of recovering from a long spiritual convalescence or something.
Okay.
He became a Christian in large part because of the influence of Tolkien and another friend called Hugo Dyson, both of them Christians, who encouraged Lewis to engage with Christianity more imaginatively, more narratively and symbolically, and not just... in other words, to engage with Christianity as the true myth. That was the important phrase. Christianity has sort of a mythic dimension to it, which chimes with pagan myths that Lewis had grown up loving and finding very profound and suggestive, dying and rising God stories. But with Christianity, Lewis sort of set aside his imaginative and sort of dramatic engagement with Christianity and sort of just dried it out, desiccated it, translated it into doctrines and into concepts, into a sort of theological framework, and left the story in the dust, as it were. But Tolkien and Dyson said, well, principally, Christianity is a story. Before it's a theological framework or a system of thought, it's a drama. In this case, a historical drama. A real man in a real time, in a real place, doing real things, in the way that, the pagan gods, nobody ever believes they were historical personages. But Christianity is well documented historically. Yet it becomes a fact, historically, without ceasing to be a drama. It's the true myth. And when Lewis saw it in those terms, it was a great sort of obstacle, a hurdle overcome. And a week or so after that conversation with Tolkien and Dyson, he said, I've passed over from believing in God to definitely believing in Christ.
Yeah, gosh, it's a story that's been told in many ways. One thing that's worth mentioning at this point is that you've not only documented that journey yourself in your writings about Lewis, but you've sort of played a part in the drama of Lewis's life. There was a film a couple of years ago that came out, again titled after that caption, The Most Reluctant Convert. And who did you play in the film?
I played C.S. Lewis's vicar, his parish priest,
nice.
in the very church where he worshipped, and indeed his body is buried in the churchyard. Holy Trinity, Headington Quarry, just outside Oxford. We spent 2 whole days filming a scene in which is recreated that actual historical moment when he, after returning to his Christian faith, he goes to Holy Communion on Christmas Day for the first time in many years and receives communion. And I'm the parish priest, and I'm giving him communion. It was weird.
How was that? That's quite an Inception.
I know, and all the more so because
very meta.
Not only were we in the real church, but there were two C.S. Lewises. The young actor, played by Nicholas Ralph. The young Lewis, played by Nicholas Ralph. And the old Lewis, played by, oh, golly, what's his name?
Max.
Max McLean.
Yes.
Both of whom were very strong physical likenesses to the young and the old Lewis. And so I'm sitting in the vicar's stall, looking out into the congregation. There's a very lifelike young C.S. Lewis, and looming in the background is very old C.S. Lewis. And 50 yards outside the building in the churchyard is the dead C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
And I got chills. It was weird.
Very, very. I mean, this is a bit of a side thing, but this isn't the only starring role you've had. It should be said. You managed to somehow land up in the background of a James Bond film.
Not the background, Justin.
Sorry.
The foreground.
Yes. Absolutely.
For a nanosecond, I was actually the person that the camera was focused on.
Wow. Amazing.
As I handed James Bond a pair of X-ray spectacles.
There you go.
Or rather, he snatched them out of my hand, and I had to give him an angry look.
That sounds very
for which
James
I was
Bond.
paid extra.
I'm sure the royalties are still rolling in from that.
If only.
No, but I mean, obviously, apart from your starring roles in the film adaptations, you've obviously devoted your life really to understanding Lewis, his life, his work, and so on. I mean, Lewis himself, in a sense, is well known as a Christian apologist, someone who, once he had come to faith, started to help others in their journey. And you have all those sort of well-known works of apologetics, Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain, and so on. But obviously most people, like you, first encounter Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia. That's probably inevitably the thing he is best known for. What's going on there? Because the Chronicles of Narnia kind of came somewhat late, arguably, in his life, didn't they?
Yeah.
So why do you think he started writing fantasy fiction?
Good question. I mean, Narnia was published from 1950 to 56, by which time Lewis was already, in his own 50s, and he died at 64. He had published other fictional works in the previous decade or so. The precise reason why he turns to writing Narnia is a very complicated question, actually. And some people say it was caused by a debate that he had at the Socratic Club in Oxford, a philosophical debating society of which he was president, and to which all sorts of unbelievers were invited to interact with Lewis and other Christians on topics of religious controversy. And Lewis usually ran the table. He was a very successful, pugnacious debater, and nobody could ever put him down, except on this one occasion. And the subject of the debate was miracles, his book on miracles. And the opponent in the debate was actually not an unbeliever, but a very devout young Catholic philosopher called Elizabeth Anscombe, who had studied under Wittgenstein. And she tackled Lewis's book on miracles and with sort of surgical precision said, "You haven't quite used that word rightly." And Lewis was sort of rocked back on his heels because it's the first time anyone has sort of bested him in debate. And it became this sort of urban myth. Did you see Lewis trounced at the Socratic Club last night by this young woman? And so people like A.N. Wilson and others have said, Lewis was so shocked by this debate in philosophy that he retreated into fantasy.
Right.
He couldn't hack it as
licking his wounds.
Exactly. Yeah, he couldn't hack it as a real rational thinker. So what's next? Fairy tale, which is absurd.
Yeah.
And I think actually his turn to The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe was his own attempt to retell in sort of imaginative and dramatic and symbolic form the argument that he had been making in Miracles, which Elizabeth Anscombe had said needed tightening up. Because Lewis was above all things a poet.
Okay.
At least that's how he conceived of himself. He said, from the age of 16 onwards, I had this burning ambition to be a poet. And indeed, the first 2 books he ever published were books of poetry. But he never succeeded in writing verse that either sold well or was critically esteemed. Nonetheless, he did have poetic gifts, great poetic gifts. He understood language, he understood symbol and metaphor, and he transferred those gifts from his verse into his prose. And his sideline as a sort of philosopher or apologist was really just that, a sideline. He was fundamentally, foundationally, he said, an imaginative man, and the imaginative side in him was older and more continuously operative than the argumentative side.
Wow.
So the argument in Miracles was worth doing, but when Elizabeth Anscombe pointed out a little wrinkle in it, which Lewis accepted and later rewrote the offending chapter to take into account her criticisms. But when he realized there was a wrinkle, I think he said to himself, well, how can I retell this argument to myself and eventually to my readers, symbolically, narratively, dramatically? And The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, I think, was the answer to that question.
That's fascinating. So we, as has already been mentioned, we had a conversation with Holly Ordway, and she was very firm in sort of the idea that Tolkien didn't create Middle Earth and didn't write everything that sits within it as an evangelistic or some kind of like missional piece of work. Would you say that that's different with regards to C.S. Lewis's primary intentions with Narnia?
No, I don't think I would say it's different.
Okay.
Not with the primary intention.
Okay.
I think Lewis had more complex intentions than Tolkien. Lewis says, and I believe him on this, that he began writing Narnia because he wanted to tell a story about images that had been in his mind's eye since he was a young boy. The image of a great lion, of a fawn in a snowy wood carrying an umbrella and parcels.
So those had been sort of characters, images that had lived and grown with him.
Exactly, those pictures had been in his mind's eye. And then one day he said to himself, let's make a story about it.
Wow.
And of course, Lewis being an English literary scholar and indeed poet, knew that a story only works if it's a good piece of literature. You can't say to yourself, however worthily, I'm going to say something about Christianity, and therefore, because I've got a good thing to say, that the literature will be any good. It's got to qualify literarily
yes.
In order to be good literature. And so that was Lewis's primary intent, I think, to write a good story.
Okay.
Now, secondarily, he then has an additional purpose of saying something about Christianity. But that's got to be woven into the warp and the woof of the tale. And unless the tale works in its own right, then the Christian message is not going to have any purchase.
Okay.
So there was a bit more of an explicit sort of...
Oh, yes, much more. No, and I don't mean to say that there's nothing deliberately allegorical. There is. I mean, Lewis actually liked not to use that word allegory about Narnia. He said it's more of a supposition. Let us suppose that the Son of God became incarnate in a world like Narnia. Let us suppose he takes the form of a lion.
Okay.
Just as he did in his science fiction, in a way.
Yes.
Where he imagined what Jesus coming to an alien race might look like.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the point is that the supposition is, as I say, secondary, and unless the story works in it as a story first, the message is sort of irrelevant. And indeed, quite a lot of readers read Narnia without ever becoming aware that there is anything Christian about it.
Yeah, many.
It's not so blatant that you would immediately. Obviously, once you know.
Yeah.
I mean, what did Tolkien make of this when he was first presented with Narnia?
Yeah, well, Tolkien was quite a hard man to please, actually. He disliked nearly everything that Lewis wrote in one way or another.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he was very fastidious and in some ways rather pedantic.
Which comes through, arguably, in the way he, maps his whole universe.
Yeah.
Down to the language of
well,
the
exactly.
elf
Whole
speak
languages
and
are invented for Middle Earth, and genealogies and backstories and appendices. The Return of the King comes with, I think, 8 appendices.
That's a real controlling issue, isn't it? Yeah.
And for Tolkien, an imagined world had to have what he called the inner consistency of reality. It must be as believable as the real world.
Okay.
Now, Lewis, in creating Narnia, is trying to make a world which you can imaginatively inhabit. It's thoroughgoing enough for that purpose, but it's not like an alternative reality, absolutely.
Yes,
You can easily get to the edges of Narnia in a
yes.
way which you can't so easily get to the edges of Middle-earth. So Tolkien disliked Narnia for two main reasons. One, he thought it was a bit slapdash, and all sorts of different mythological literary traditions are thrown together in Narnia, which Tolkien didn't much like personally. And then he also disliked it because he thought the sort of allegorical element showed through a bit too noticeably. So for those reasons, he didn't like Narnia and soon gave up trying to read the books after they were published. However, as Holly quite rightly says, his dislike has been magnified into this complete rejection of Narnia in absolutist terms. And that's not true, because he said that Narnia was deservedly very popular. And he kept copies of the Chronicles on his shelves for his grandchildren to read. And he was happy for them to read. He just said, personally, I'm out of imaginative sympathy with these books. But that was a personal point of view. It wasn't a sort of objective critique that everybody must follow me in disliking these books.
Yes. Do you think, knowing C.S. Lewis's sort of the way his brain works as it does, do you agree with, in particular, the slapdash critique of Narnia?
Not at all.
Oh, okay.
And we're coming to the point of one of your best known books
Here we go.
at this point.
It's almost like you're setting me up to talk about this book.
Planet Narnia, for those who can't see this on video. Yeah.
Planet Narnia is a book I wrote all about this very question as to whether Narnia is indeed a hodgepodge thrown together in an afternoon, as it were. Lewis retreating into fantasy because he has nothing better to do with his time.
Yeah.
And that's just totally wrong, in my view. And it's amazing to me that it ever got any traction with the public mind, because anybody who knows anything about C.S. Lewis knows that he wasn't a random or a slapdash writer or thinker. He was a very rigorous and consistent thinker. He had one of the best trained minds, one of the most disciplined minds that's ever lived. And in particular, he had a love for and interest in complexity and intricacy. As a medieval scholar, he loved studying writers like, Dante, Chaucer, Spencer, Milton, writers, he said, who love to present us with something which can't be taken in at a glance.
Yes.
Everything leads to everything else in these writers, he says, but often by very intricate paths, and they like to present us with something which at first looks planless, though all is planned. That's his view of medieval and Renaissance writers. And in his own writing, I think he followed their example. He gives you something which at first looks a bit sort of slapdash. So, the critique of Narnia as a bit random is ostensibly plausible. But once you dig into the deep sort of imaginative substructure, the blueprint, as it were, that he's working to, then Narnia turns out to be minutely and sophisticatedly imagined, according, I believe, to what he called the spiritual symbols of permanent value that he found in the seven heavens of the medieval cosmos.
I am just popping in to invite you to be a part of our Seen and Unseen community. You can have Seen and Unseen sent straight to your inbox. On Tuesdays, our editors give a weekly roundup of things that have caught their eye in culture, current affairs, trends, all of it. On Fridays, you will have the best of Seen and Unseen articles delivered directly to your inbox. And you will also be first to know about any events that we have coming up. So head to seenandunseen.com to subscribe.
So tell us about this structure. And the reason we've got you on to talk about this is arguably because you were the first person to realize this, Michael. So you potentially discovered a kind of, want a better word, Easter egg hidden in the Narnia stories that no one up to that point had discovered, because Lewis had very carefully hidden it away, let's say, as maybe a surprise for someone to dig out. And you think you're the person who discovered the thing he'd hidden within the Narnia stories.
There are a couple of critics, actually, who, before me, noticed how very lunar the Silver Chair is. The Silver Chair book is written according to the imagery of the moon.
Okay,
and someone had noticed that. And another person had noticed how very saturnine the last battle is. But they hadn't followed up those leads either within those two particular books or across the series of Narnia as a whole. And that did fall to me to do.
Right. Tell me first of all when the penny dropped, because I think that you've got. I think there was a poem you read.
That's right.
And this kind of suddenly something twigged in your mind.
That's right. I was reading his poem, which is called simply The Planet. It's about the seven heavens. And I'm lying in bed one night, halfway through my PhD research, and I'm reading the lines about Jupiter, as Jupiter was understood in the Middle Ages. And one of the things that Jupiter sort of influenced, according to that way of thinking, was, in Lewis's words, winter past and guilt forgiven. That's a Jupiter influence on the earth. Winter past and guilt forgiven.
Okay.
And that was what twigged in my mind as a connection to The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which is all about the passing of the White Witch's winter and the forgiving of Edmund's guilt. So once I'd made that little connection, my mind, slowly grinding.
Was it like a eureka moment?
Well, it turned out to be, yes.
Right.
As soon as I sort of ground on to the idea, there are another 6 planets and there are another 6 chronicles. Do they all match up?
Wow.
And it was easy, I felt, to see that they did. Then I, as it were, said to myself, eureka, and jumped out of bed and began pulling the Narnia books off the shelf and tracing links from work to work.
So just sketch out, if you will, this is obviously the work of many pages in your books, but kind of what each book seems to represent in terms of this planetary system and what some of the themes are that speak to those.
Well, first of all, let's just clarify what we mean by the 7 heavens. And the best way to understand that is in connection with the names of the days of the week. Sunday is named after the sun, because the sun used to be thought of as a planet.
Okay.
And Monday, likewise, after the moon used to be thought of as a planet, not just as a satellite of Earth.
Okay.
And Saturday, obviously, after Saturn. Then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday are Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, and Venus. If you think in French, it's a bit more obvious because Mardi for Tuesday, Mardi Gras, Mars Day, and Mercredi, Mercury's Day.
Okay.
Jeudi, Jove's Day. Think in Spanish, Jueves. Jove is Jupiter. And then Vendredi for Venus for Friday. So every day of our lives, we're referring to this old heptarchy, as it's called. And Lewis regarded these planetary personalities and all their attributes and influences as I say, spiritual symbols that were permanently valuable, especially in his own generation. Because his own generation was the generation that went through the First World War. And Lewis himself had been a teenage officer in the Great War and had been nearly killed in that conflict. And so Lewis sometimes talks about the culture of the 1920s and 30s as Saturnocentric, because Saturn is symbolically associated with death and disaster. And so Lewis's generation, having gone through the First World War, was all too well acquainted with Saturn. Saturn is, you think of the Grim Reaper, Father Time with his scythe and his hourglass, cutting people down. 750,000 British servicemen were killed in that conflict. So you can understand why people became Saturnocentric. There was a sort of collective nervous breakdown in the whole of Western Europe after the First World War. And all these sort of growths in absurdism and cynicism and pessimism and the theatre of cruelty, and it had all sorts of artistic bitter fruits in due course. But Lewis thought the 7 heavens remind us that Saturn is not the only symbol. It's not even the best. There are another 6 ways of interpreting spiritual reality, and the best of them is actually Jupiter, because Jupiter is the king of the gods, the center of the whole scheme. So Lewis says in one place, of Saturn we know more than enough, but who does not need to be reminded of Jove, of Jupiter? This kingly, magnanimous, festive, prosperous symbol. And so The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, I believe, was written to sort of incorporate, to embed silently, but thoroughgoingly in every part of the story, this jovial atmosphere, this jovial spirit. So Aslan is the true king, and the children become kings and queens themselves. They live into this jovial reality, and winter passes and guilt is forgiven. And you have Father Christmas with his red robe.
Yeah, I was going to say Christmas pops up.
Exactly,
This
'cause,
idea
yeah,
of
Which
within...
again is something presumably Tolkien would have thought was absurd.
Yes.
Father
Yeah,
Christmas
what's Christmas
alongside, Greek mythological creatures. and so
Exactly.
on.
Yeah, it doesn't belong on one level,
Yeah.
but at this deep level of the spiritually symbolic logic, it belongs
Yes.
absolutely.
I suppose even then, winter is twisted into something that's joyful.
Yes.
When Jupiter,
Exactly.
it doesn't get the final say, even right in the midst of it.
Exactly.
There's a little
Yeah.
speck of joy.
January passes and May
Yes.
green, May jollity, summertime come in.
Yeah.
And so that's, in my view, the sort of imaginative DNA of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe.
Mm.
And then to go through the other 6 planets very quickly. Prince Caspian is the Mars book, full of military events and
Yes.
chivalry and gallantry. And the Dawn Treader is the Sun book.
And that, of course, it's literally called The Dawn Treader,
Yes.
and it has a big sun on the sail. There were a few
Yes,
kind of
quite.
things that Lewis dropped in there as hints, I
Yeah,
suppose.
exactly. It's not
Yeah,
that hidden
yeah.
once you see it.
Yes.
The Silver Chair is the Moon book. Again, silver and the moon, of course, are obviously
Yes.
connected.
And connected as well with the concept of madness, as in lunacy comes
Yes.
from Luna. And it's
Yes.
obviously a story about someone who people think goes mad for 1 hour every
Yes.
night, but it's actually when he's most sane and
Exactly.
all the rest
Yes,
of it.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
And it's a book all about wetness and wanderings and all those lunar qualities. The Horse and His Boy is the Mercury story. The Magician's Nephew is the Venus book. And The Last Battle, in which everyone dies, is, of course, the Saturn story.
Right.
Okay.
So Lewis gives Saturn his due, as it were. He's not going to pretend that we don't suffer and die. We do, but suffering and death are not, they don't have the last word. Because right at the end of the last battle, after everybody goes through this mouth of the door of death, those who are in harmony with the Christ of that world, Aslan, come into a new life.
Yeah.
And it's a life, interestingly, dominated again by Jupiter.
Right.
Because you might remember that at the end of the last battle, Lucy, having been resurrected, says to Eustace, I think it is, or Edmund, have you noticed you can't now feel afraid anymore, even if you try to? By Jove, neither can you, says.
And I thought those little turns of phrase were just, his 1940s slang, but maybe they were meant to be there. The by
There's a
Joves.
double meaning in that.
That's the
Yes,
one
let the reader understand.
That's one of the richest one of the richest lines of theology that you could find anywhere, I think,
It
is
is.
that, have you
Yes.
noticed we can't be afraid anymore? How
Yes.
can you refine or improve upon that? It sums
Yeah.
up so much.
It does.
It,
But you can't file for it by Jove.
yeah.
That's the important
Yeah,
bit.
it's
yeah.
qualified
By
by that.
Jupiter.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
Jupiter is now being used as a symbol for Christ.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Why? I mean, maybe he didn't, because as you explain it, you kind of think, oh my goodness, of course. Whereas my question was going to be, why did he keep this so hidden? Why wouldn't he, if he's getting these criticisms of him falling into fantasy or Tolkien saying it's all a bit slapdash, why didn't he tell us that he was doing this?
Because he wanted to address our imaginations and not our intellects.
Okay.
He wanted, I think, to make us feel that these worlds, these 7 different worlds, had a sort of integrity, even though you couldn't easily identify what it was that was holding the world together. And he did that because I think he saw it as a reflection of the situation that obtains in the real world. That in the real world, too, you look out on a great variety of data, which can be interpreted in lots of different ways. And those who say that, Saturn does indeed dominate and that everything is meaningless, vanity, vanity, all is vanity, saith the preacher, they're not completely irrational in saying that. There's evidence for that. But is that the correct conclusion? And of course, Lewis, as an atheist, did once believe that the world was meaningless. He did, as it were, buy into the Saturnine interpretation of reality. But when he became a Christian, everything changed. He went through a complete 180 degrees shift. The universe hadn't changed, but his perspective on it had changed completely. So what, a question that a Christian might ask is, why doesn't God make things more obvious? Why doesn't God make it clear so that, so that we needn't be in any doubt? And that's a very interesting theological question.
Yeah.
And the answer, a simple answer to that, I think, would be that God respects our freedom. God wants a relationship with us of love, not power. And love respects the freedom of the beloved. As Lewis says in one place, God cannot ravish, he can only woo. A coercive, power-based relationship is not one of love. God doesn't want to dominate us in that sense. He wants a free response. So he gives us just enough evidence, as it were, for us to think, oh yeah, God is here, and Christ lived, and there's the church, and there's the Bible. But it's not sort of overwhelmingly obvious, so that every person instantly says, oh, well, of course. Now, take that into Narnia.
Yeah.
Lewis gives us just enough evidences, I think, of the planetary scheme that when it's pointed out, you can say, oh, yes, of course, that must be his controlling imaginative blueprint. But not so much evidence that everybody saw it immediately. And if he had told us this was what he was up to, it would have ruined the whole thing.
Would have been boring. Yeah.
I do wonder sometimes whether if Tolkien had bothered to read the rest of the stories, he might have put the pieces together before even you did, Michael.
Possibly.
And maybe he might have had slightly more respect at that point for what Lewis was trying to do with this. I mean, but the imagination is sort of something we talk about a lot on this show.
Yeah.
Re-Enchanting really draws its name from that Max Weber thing of, living in a disenchanted world. And I and you, to some extent, have spent quite a bit of our lives in the realm of apologetics, same one that Lewis did, trying to give a sort of intellectual, rational defense of the Christian faith. But what's fascinating, obviously, about Lewis is that he obviously, his most successful apologetic, in a sense, was one that dealt really with fantasy literature, imagination. There was a lot of apologetics just below the surface, I think, actually. But it was almost, I think we sort of need to be reminded of that sometimes, that Lewis, that we have to start with the imagination, because that's really where I think the rubber hits the road for most people. You can give them facts and logic and philosophy, but if they don't sort of intuitively want it to be true at a sort of imaginative level, I think a lot of that stuff just won't ever land in the end. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Well, I think it's one of the reasons we're a bit sort of tangled about this, I think, is because we use the terms imagination and reason rather imprecisely. And Lewis defines them very carefully. He says imagination is the organ of meaning, and reason is the natural organ of truth. And something can't be either true or false. In other words, it can't be rationally apprehended until it means something. Meaning, he says, is the antecedent condition of both truth and falsehood. A lie means something. It's false. And if someone is lying to you, you might say, well, what does this mean about them? What does it mean about my relationship to them? The thing they're saying is untrue, but it means something. Yeah. In other words, it can be apprehended imaginatively. And then when you bring your reason to bear upon that meaningful statement, the reason says it's false, but it means. So imagination is the precondition of all our knowing and all modes of discourse, including philosophy and science. So it's not the case that art and the humanities are imaginative but irrational, whereas science and mathematics are rational but unimaginative. No, both properly done are imaginative and rational.
Yeah.
It's just the kinds of things that art and science find meaningful are different. Science finds quantity meaningful. The basis of science is mathematics. And art, humanities, and indeed all poetry, and you might say philosophy and religion too, find different things meaningful, not quantity, but quality, personality, purpose, those sorts of more indefinable, less measurable qualities, meaningful things, you can't easily, turn something like Shakespeare's Hamlet into an equation. You can't say, what does it mean numerically? What's the statistical significance of Hamlet? I mean, that's an irrelevant question. That's not the kind of meaning that it deals in. And likewise, there's no point in saying to Einstein, well, what's the dramatic flair behind E equals mc squared? These are separate modes of discourse, but they are both imaginative and they are both rational, at least where they are true. They are engaged in reasonable discourse.
And to that extent, Lewis believed you could receive truth through storytelling in that sense, and that shouldn't be sort of put in a completely different camp to the philosophy
which
that he also loved.
Brings us back to your initial question about his conversion. And the true myth that he finally realized was the best way of understanding Christianity. It was not best understood by translating it into doctrines and concepts, however important those may be, because those are secondary, those are ancillary modes of discourse. They have their place, but they're not the language that is most adequate to the thing being described. And indeed, that's a very important phrase that Lewis uses. He says the mythic, the narrative, the dramatic way of understanding Christianity is the language more adequate than any other. You can translate the narrative of Christianity, the story, into a system of thought, into theological concepts and creedal statements and all those important things that theologians like to do. But you're translating from a richer language into a poorer language in so doing. You're making things more precise, so that's why you tend to do it, because it enables you to speak more clearly, less equivocally. But in other respects, you're trading down, which is why Christianity is best understood as a story, a true story. It's imaginative, yes, and rational.
Yeah.
But we tend to think, we tend to fall into this trap of saying one is imaginative, one is rational.
False dichotomy.
False dichotomy.
Yes, yeah. Shall we, I want to hear so much more about that, but shall we move on to what I find, and I'll admit it, I'll put my cards on the table, one of C.S. Lewis's most difficult works. I've never fully got it, but you have worked on it, and I'm so thankful that you have. The Abolition of Man. Can you tell, for anyone who has never even heard that title, let alone tried to grapple with it, tell us what The Abolition of Man is?
The Abolition of Man is a very short, slim book based on 3 philosophy lectures that Lewis gave during the Second World War on the question of value and whether value is objective or subjective. That's what it's basically about. And that makes it sound all rather dry and philosophical, which it is, relatively speaking. And coming back to this question about the dichotomy between, the sort of propositional or argumentative over against the mythic. The Abolition of Man is the sort of argumentative version of Lewis's novel, That Hideous Strength. He says as much.
Okay.
That the ideas expressed philosophically in The Abolition of Man are turned into story in That Hideous Strength.
For those who don't know, That Hideous Strength is part of a science fiction trilogy, that far less well known than Narnia, but dealing with not dissimilar themes often.
Absolutely. Now, if people have read Mere Christianity, they might remember that Mere Christianity opens with Lewis saying, everybody has heard people arguing. People say, give me a bit of your orange. I gave you a bit of mine. Why are you sitting in that seat? I was there first. Lewis immediately draws you into the question of right and wrong. Why do people think that they have a claim on the chair because they were there first? Why do they expect justice in the handing out of orange segments? It's because we all have innately, intrinsically, a sense of right and wrong, and right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe is the title of that first part of Mere Christianity. In other words, Lewis is there arguing for the objective nature of value. It's a much more sort of accessible and popular version of the argument that he makes at a highbrow level in The Abolition of Man. So if you want to sort of limber up, as it were, for the Abolition of Man, you can't do better than just reread the first few chapters of Mere Christianity.
Okay, good tip.
Because it's effectively the same argument,
okay,
but made much more sort of popularly.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, the Abolition of Man, as you say, it does deal with some kind of weighty sort of issues. And it's interesting you make the connection there with that hideous strength of this sort of rather dystopian sort of final part of his science fiction trilogy, which deals with sort of the way in which technology can go awry and the way in which those values, if they're not grounded in something bigger than just our kind of ability to do things, can go off in different directions. It feels like a lot of that is quite relevant to the things we're talking about, often on, episodes of Re-Enchanting, artificial intelligence, technology, and everything else. I mean, Lewis obviously lived in the age he lived in. Why is it that we're, I guess, still talking about Lewis? It seems like a lot of the things he had to say, even in books like that, still seem to be pertinent to the issues we're facing.
They are. In some ways, they're becoming only more pertinent. I don't know if you've ever had on the show John Gray, the philosopher, who
we would love to, but we haven't had him on before.
But interestingly, he's a self-described atheist, but he loves the abolition of man because although he's an atheist, he believes, I think, in objective value.
Right.
And he's done a BBC radio broadcast about the abolition of man and describes it as prophetic, prescient.
He describes it as prophetic.
Yes, and as relevant now as when it first came out, if not more so.
Wow, okay.
That's from an atheist,
Yeah.
but an atheist, I think, who believes in objective value. Now, Lewis was a very insightful person and loved following a line of logic, sometimes to an absurd conclusion. But I think he saw in the 1930s in particular certain attitudes to the world that were gaining traction with people. And he, as it were, thought his way down that line. Where's that going to eventuate? The idea that simply because you can do something, therefore you are entitled to do it. Well, is that really the case? I mean, you boil that down, that comes down to a statement that might makes right. That's a sort of Nietzschean will to power. I can do something, so I will do something. It's like Jurassic Park.
Yes.
The scientists were so keen to realize that they could do. They never stopped to ask whether they should.
Yes. Okay.
Classic Jeff Goldblum line.
Thank you, Jeff Goldblum.
Yes, Jurassic Park. That's right. Yeah.
And we're seeing that attitude of might makes right. It's of course it's not just a 20th and 21st century problem. It's a perennial problem. It's a kind of description of sin. Why did Adam and Eve take the apple? Well, because they could. And they didn't stop to think whether they should. So it's a question of asserting one's own view of value over objective value. In other words, it's making oneself into God. That's the problem. So it's always been with us and always will be with us, except in the last 100 years or so, because of advances in science and technology, we can now extend these powers into all sorts of domains that never previously would have been thought of as manipulable.
And to that extent, the abolition of man and your guide to it, which talks about the end of humanity and so on, is that sort of what we're potentially seeing the dangers of in the way in which we now treat science and technology, artificial intelligence, transhumanism, this idea that perhaps we can make ourselves immortal through technology and so on. And I guess just what does literally the title mean? What does Lewis mean by the abolition of man? Is it something to do with the idea that humans are effectively trying to sort of replace themselves at some level with something that is non-human in that way?
Yeah. Well, the abolition of man comes about by the eradication of that peculiarly human aspect of our identity, which I think Lewis effectively associates with the willingness, the capacity to do something that is good in itself, irrespective of whether it is good for us as individuals. That's the distinctively human capacity. But we don't see that animals are altruistic in that sense. And therefore, in The Abolition of Man, Lewis keeps coming back to this sort of critical question. He calls it the experimentum crucis, the crucial experiment, as to whether there's any value in self-sacrifice. He keeps coming back to this old Latin tag from the Roman writer Horace, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It's sweet and fitting to die for one's country. And it's interesting that he uses a sort of Roman and sort of pagan proverb, whereas he could quite easily, and indeed at one point he does just slip in the obviously more Christian version. Greater love hath no man than this, than that a man lay down his life for his friends. But it's interesting, as far as Lewis is concerned, that both the pagan Horace and the Christian tradition both see value in self-sacrifice. Why? Because it's the innately and intrinsically human thing to do. Christianity brings it to a new sort of level, a new sort of purpose, a new sort of expression of the depth of reality, that this is actually found in God's interaction with humanity. It's not just something that we as humans choose to do amongst ourselves. But in both cases, the point is that if you want to be truly human, you need to lay down your power, all your power, your very life, if need be, because you see that something is more important than you and your life. In other words, you realize that you're not the be-all and end-all of the universe. You are not God. There are values outside you. And nature, red in tooth and claw, the sort of Darwinian fight for survival, the survival of the fittest, would never acknowledge that as a reasonable way of going about things. That's why it's distinctively human. And if we give up on that capacity, then we abolish ourselves, the abolition of man.
So because it's not, again, for anyone who hasn't read The Abolition of Man, it's not, as you've hinted towards, an overtly Christian text at all. It's philosophy, and like you say, it's it draws other analogies from other things. But would you make the case that actually it's an incredibly theological text?
I would. Yeah, it's an avowedly philosophical work. Lewis is leaving theology to one side. Indeed, he says this very clearly at one point in the book. Though I am myself a theist and indeed a Christian, I am not attempting here any even indirect argument for Christianity.
Which is perhaps why John Gray appreciates it as well.
Exactly. And all sorts of readers do across the spectrum. Atheists, agnostics, secularists, as well as a variety of people of different faiths. But it's a very powerfully made philosophical defense of the objectivity of value, which of course is foundational to every other sort of human endeavor. Art, justice, religions of all kinds, they all presuppose that value is objective. So in a way, it's a sort of, it has been described, The Abolition of Man, as a piece of anthropology. It's a sort of anthropological philosophy.
Okay.
You know, what is it that makes us human, distinctively human? And this is Lewis's case. And he sees it as a necessary first step to a defense of theism and Christianity, because you can only be a Christian if you're a human being first, obviously. So what is it that makes us human? And it's effectively our capacity for acknowledging objective value, our conscience, in other words, which is, from a Christian point of view, a vestige of having been made in the image of the Creator.
And this, in a neat way, kind of brings us back to what we began with, which is Lewis's conversion, which you described in some detail, the Christian element of that. But the conversion to theism was specifically because Lewis, as an atheist, began to recognize he actually believed in objective morality.
Yes.
And he realized, well, if that's true, then there's something else going on in the universe.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, he sort of argued himself philosophically into what might be called absolute idealism. I think that's the technical term for it. And then eventually began to think, well, what is this sort of absolute ideal that calls us to goodness and truth and beauty? Couldn't that equally well be called God? And that's it, in a very rough and ready fashion. That's the sort of move that he made from idealism to theism, and then from theism to Christianity. Yeah.
Well, we feel like we've done the full gamut almost of Lewis by kind of starting with his story, his extraordinary fiction, to his obviously very serious, in-depth philosophical work. It was an extraordinarily, as you say, deep, precise thinker. We're still talking about him. We haven't got around to talking about the fact that there's going to be a new Narnia series potentially on the cards soon on Netflix and things like that. But we're still fascinated, aren't we, by Lewis? We're still talking about it. We're still, making films and series of his work. Is that just because he was such a good communicator? What is behind the continuing resonance of Lewis, would you say, today?
It's largely that he was a brilliant communicator, yes. It's largely that he was able to communicate both propositionally and poetically, which a lot of people can't. They can do one or the other, but not usually both. But it was also, I think, just because he was a person of profound faith. Walter Hooper, his secretary and editor, said that Lewis was the most thoroughly converted man that he ever met.
That's such a title.
But I think it's true that God sort of took hold of C.S. Lewis in his 30s and sort of shook him by the scruff of the neck, and Lewis had sort of profound spiritual experiences, which he just occasionally gestures towards in his writings. He's too private to admit us to what's really gone on between him and God, as it were.
Yes.
But you get a sense that here's a man who's been thoroughly caught up into almost mystical experiences. Lewis hesitates ever to claim the title mystic, but he had profound spiritual insights. And because of his gifts as a communicator, he was able to weave that insightfulness into his fiction in ways that resonate with us artistically. That's why he's so continuingly relevant and valuable, because like all great poets, he's expressing the inexpressible. What oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed. He can communicate the incommunicable because he's a brilliant genius of poetic gifts. So if I can suddenly bring this back to the whole question of enchantment.
Please do.
Lewis loved Psalm 19. The heavens are telling the glory of God. The celestial bodies are, as it were, continually singing this perpetual gloria of praise to God. But we can't hear it. It doesn't make a sound. Shakespeare talks about this in Merchant of Venice. The patines of bright gold, the floor of heaven is thick inlaid with patines of bright gold. There's not the smallest orb which thou beholdst, but in his motion like an angel sings, still choiring to the young-eyed cherubim. But whiles this muddy vesture of decay doth grossly close us in, we cannot hear it. What Shakespeare is getting at, what the psalmist is getting at, is that, yes, the universe is radiant with, redolent with, resonant with these glories of the divine creator, but you can't hear it because of your sinfulness, because of your finitude. But the more sanctified you become, the more you can, as it were, tune into that particular frequency and begin to hear it. And I think Lewis, like many great writers and many great saints, was able to get on that frequency. And not just that, but then render it in literary form.
And Gosh, aren't we glad he did? I can't imagine kind of a world without C.S. Lewis. Can you? I can't even fathom.
Well, I can't
it.
imagine Michael's world without C.S.
No,
Lewis.
I can't.
As we've
No.
experienced.
Whose house would you have lived in?
It's been brilliant. Thank you, Michael, for just this wonderful tour of Lewis's mind and imagination and theology and philosophy. Again, if you want more, there are a number of books actually that Michael's written in this area, but Planet Narnia, that certainly deals with some of the themes we've talked about, the Narnia Code again, and most recently the Abolition of Man and Michael's companion to that, After Humanity. So thank you so much for being our guest on Re-Enchanting, Michael. Another absolutely perfect topic for Re-Enchanting.
Perfect.
Right in the sweet spot.
Yes.
Links with today's show if you want to follow up and check out more of Michael's stuff. But for now, thank you so much for being with us.
Indeed. And do visit seenandunseen.com for more resources from us, and seenandunseen.com/give if you would like to help future episodes just like this happen.
For now, thanks for being with us. See you next time.